Okay, I want to welcome everybody tonight as we continue our study in the book of Exodus. Tonight we're going to be in chapter 18. And for those of you who are not here and are tuning in via live, I apologize in advance for any of the rain you may hear because there may be periods of hard rain and I don't know how much of it you may hear in the background. But with that said, we're going to jump back into chapter 18. This is the last chapter before we focus on the events that take place at Mount Sinai with the giving of the law. So there's going to be a lot to discuss when we get into chapter 19 and we start to move forward. It'll probably slow us down in being able to cover a chapter each week because there's going to be so much to kind of filter through in the story of the giving of the law and the actual laws themselves. And so with that said, this is kind of a slower chapter where there's really not much to discuss other than what the text actually says. But let me remind you just for a moment before we jump into this chapter of what we encountered in chapter 17. And that was, and hopefully if you weren't here, you have seen that, because that is one of the important lessons thus far in nailing down some of the locations of where these events took place. We spent quite a bit of time really pinning down where the wilderness of Shur is, the wilderness of Sin or Tzin, the wilderness of Sinai, where Mount Sinai would have been, where Rephidim was, where the events took place last week. And so looking at the map, we know with certainty, based on what we studied and what the text itself says, that the crossing of the Sea of Reed had to have taken place on the western side of the Sinai Peninsula. The exact location cannot be determined, but it has to be on the west side. The reason why I bring that up is because there are some proposals that it took place somewhere over here, and Mount Sinai is down here, where you see Jebel el-Lawz. But we proved last week that is completely impossible. First of all, it says that when they left Egypt, immediately after the Red Sea crossing, it says they entered in the wilderness of Shur. And several weeks ago, we did a lot of cross-referencing, and we were able to determine with certainty, absolute certainty, the wilderness of Shur borders up against the Nile Delta region, which is only located on the western side. So the Red Sea crossing had to take place somewhere on the western side. Okay, the wilderness of Shur is right here, and we have followed in the last few chapters the advancing of the Israelites through the wilderness. And where we left off last week, we're about 3 months into their journeyings. And so they've went from the wilderness of Shur into the wilderness of what should be in this area here, at least bordering to Kadesh Barnea, is the wilderness of Sin or Tzin. Notice on the map it has it over here. That's not possible because that would be the wilderness of Sinai or Sinai, because Mount Sinai is located somewhere on the border or the overlapping of the wilderness of Sin and Sin. Now, I was looking at this map by the same publishers. Okay, watch this. The same map has the wilderness of Zin right here, but when you look at it in this version, it has the wilderness of Zin in its appropriate place. And it has to be right here based on what we seen last week in chapter 17, because they were at Rephidim, which is in the wilderness of Sin or Tzin, and they were attacked by the Amalekites, which are to their immediate north. Okay? Now, that is a fatal flaw, again, to the fact that Rephidim could be down here and Mount Sinai could be down here, because the Amalekites dwell right here in the Negev. But if you see them being at Kadesh Barnea, being the same location as Rephidim, which we proved last week, it's near where Mount Sinai would be, right in this area here. And it makes it easy to see how the Amalekites could see the Israelites and attack them when they're vulnerable. Which again disproves any other location for Mount Sinai, which we've already proven that in the earlier chapters, I think Exodus chapter 3, part 1. But it also provides further evidence that this location down here, which is probably the second most popular location, Jebel al-Lawz, as being the location for Mount Sinai. It is totally impossible. Okay, so you can rule out the Red Sea crossing being in the Gulf of Aqaba. You can rule out Mount Sinai being in Midian and Jebel al-Lawz, because it is clearly in this location on the border of the wilderness of Sin and in the wilderness of Sinai. Okay, also called the desert. Okay, that's probably a better way to think of it than wilderness is desert, because that's better captures what we think of in the English word desert. Barrenness, just sand and mountains and rocks and nothingness. So anyway, we're following in their footsteps, and last week they were at Kadesh Barnea, which is the most dominant place name for this location, but what we seen last week, it was called Rephidim, but we looked at the cross references and seen how they are one and the same place. Okay, so in chapter 18, we're going to see a story of where Moses is reunited with his family, and his father-in-law is going to give him advice on how to govern or to judge the people of Israel. We're going to see that it actually pays off for Moses and for the people of Israel. But I want to say this at the outset, and we'll kind of look at it as we go through the text. It has been said by many that chapter 18 is out of chronological order. That chapter 18, as far as the timing of when this encounter took place that we're about to read, had to have taken place after chapter 19 and the giving of the law that took place that begins in chapter 19. And the reason why that is because we'll see when we get into the text, it mentions the laws and the statutes of God. And so it's assumed that that couldn't be said before the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. I'm going to disagree with that part as a reasoning, because God has clearly established certain laws and principles up to this point in human history. I mean, they obviously know the necessity for sacrifice as early as Cain and Abel. You know, that would be considered a Torah or an instruction from God. We've seen the Sabbath observance that was instituted, how to gather the manna and how that is to be prepared as a law and a statute. We've seen several things that God has instituted. So I think that is to restrict or limit the usage of the word law or Torah in Hebrew to meaning Mosaic law always. And that's not the case. It does not always mean the Mosaic law, because there are many mentions and usages of that word prior to the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And a simple search would prove that. And you could look through Genesis and Exodus up to this point, and you will see that the word occurs several times before the giving of the Mosaic law. But that's one of the proposed reasons. Another reason is because chapter 17 ends with the story of the Amalekites, which are often grouped in the Old Testament close to the Midianites or the Kenites, which happens to be who Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, is a part of the people group. There's always a negative light cast on the Amalekites and a positive light cast on the Midianites. Well, not always, but a lot of times on the Midianites or the Kenites. And a lot of times they're paired together in Scripture. And so some of those who accept the documentary hypothesis say that that this part of Exodus was compiled post-exilic times after the Babylonian exile, and because they seen the historical records of the period of the kings and the usage of the Amalekites and the Kenites and the Midianites together a lot, that they put this back into the Torah because they reject Mosaic authorship, which we clearly accept Mosaic authorship with minimal editing. So those are some of the reasons. Now, is it possible that this story is out of chronological order? Yes. And quite frankly, it doesn't change the meaning of this story or this encounter at all. And we've already seen when we went through the book of Genesis that it is not uncommon at all for Hebrew narrative to be in not chronological order. kind of messes up our modern minds, right? We want things neat and orderly and in chronological order, but that's not the way that it worked in antiquity. They tended to place things where they are for literary purposes, which is pretty genius, right? For people that are oftentimes discredited as being inferior as far as intelligence. If you study their literature and their way of life, that is far from the truth, because they were highly intelligent people. So with that said, let's jump into the text, and I'm certain that we should be able to get all the way through chapter 18. Okay? And I'm going to try not to say right a lot tonight. Because I went back and went through Sunday's sermon. Any guesses on how many times I said right?
23.
Any guesses? 49 times. I crawled into the cave of shame. So, I'm going to try to not say that so much. Okay? It's kind of like muscle memory, right? Mental memory. It is, I give up. All right, verse 1. When Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, and that the Lord, or Yahweh, had brought Israel out of Egypt, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back. And this is referencing back to chapter 4. Originally, when Moses was on his way to Egypt, he took his wife and kids along with him. And the only one that was named at that point was Gershom, and we talked about why he was named that. But at some point, before they actually entered into Egypt, Zipporah and the children went back to the land of Midian and did not enter into the land of Egypt with Moses. And so here he's being reunited. One thing that I want to point out, backing up to verse 1, it says Jethro was the priest of Midian. And thus far in Scripture, there are 3 priests that are mentioned. A little Bible trivia for you guys who like Bible trivia. This is one of them. Can anyone name the other 2 priests that are named? I'll give you a hint. Genesis 14. Melchizedek. Or we would say Melchizedek. He was king and priest of Shalem, which is known today as the name what? Jerusalem or Jerusalem. Okay? So, he is the first one mentioned. Who is the second one? I'll give you a hint. Think story of Joseph. Think Egyptian. Think land of On. Think Potipharah. Potipharah, who is the priest of On, whose daughter was given to Joseph as a wife. Okay, so that's the 2 priests that are mentioned in Scripture prior to what we see here with Jethro. So the Israelites were not unique or one of a kind in the sense that they were the only ones that had priest or even a priesthood in the ancient Near East. This was something that other people groups had as well. The difference is who they represented. Because the one thing that separated Israel or the Hebrew people apart from other people groups is the worship of Yahweh as the one true and living God. Most of them worshipped many gods, or polytheism. Okay, so that's the 3 priests. So he comes, and how does he know where Moses is going to be, though? Well, you'd have to rewind back into chapters 3 and 4, where God has the encounter with Moses, and he tells Moses to go get his people and to return where? To this same mountain, which would have been known to Jethro And it said, if you go back into chapter 4, that Moses returned to Midian and had a conversation with Jethro about what his plans were. Now, it doesn't give us the full dialogue that they would have had. It's actually very brief, which has led some to believe that some portion of chapter 4 is missing. And I tend to agree with that, because the story of Moses and the foreskin and Zipporah, that just has 3 verses that are extremely odd, it seems like there would have been more said that could possibly missing, and more said about Moses and his interaction with Jethro before he left to return to Egypt. So I could see that as being a possibility. That part of the text was lost, and we do not have access to that, but there's no way of knowing for sure. But it's safe to say that Moses would have told Jethro, hey, I'm going to go get the Israelites and return to the mountain. Of course, you can probably think Jethro was probably like, okay, Moses, right? You're going to go to Egypt. Yeah, you're going to go and, to the most powerful nation and bring a mass group of people out. But it happened, and there's no doubt that he would have heard about it, because there has been references that said that people, word has traveled through it would have traveled through the trade merchants that would have traveled through the Sinai Peninsula, but word would have traveled what had happened in Egypt. And there's this mass that's wandering through the wilderness and has been delivered from the most powerful nation at that time to the known world. Okay, so here we have the return of them. And so we know that they're located near Mount Sinai. And so let's pick back up in the text in verse 3. It says, and her 2 sons, of which the name of one was Gershom, and here it's going to name the other. For he said, I've been an alien in a strange land, and the name of the other was Eliezer, for the God of my father. Eliezer means God of help, or God is my helper. Said he was mine help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And verse 5 says, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, here's another quiz. What's his other name? Jethro's other name? One at a time. Huh? No? Reuel. Thank you. We can hear now. Reuel is the other name of Jethro. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness, where he encamped at the mount of God. So they are right on the border of Sinai, where the events that we'll read hereafter will take place and dominate the rest of the book, actually. Verse 6, and he said to Moses, and this would be through a messenger, as we'll see, and he said to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am come up unto you, and your wife, and her 2 sons with her. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, which again shows that messengers would have came and delivered word that they were there, and did obeisance, which means he bowed before him, and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare. How's it going? How things been? And they came into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how the Lord delivered them. So Moses didn't only share about all of the good things, but he also shared about the adversity, what they had been through since they've been in the wilderness, and obviously would have shared about the recent attack from the Amalekites and how God delivered them from that as well. So he boasts in the good and the bad that they had experienced and seen God's deliverance in all of it. And that really needs to be our approach or our attitude in life. We're just going to be thankful to the Lord in the good and bad, and we're going to trust Him that He's going to be faithful and He's going to deliver us in the way that He sees fit. And so verse 9 says, "And Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, whom He had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be Yahweh," which is interesting because he's recognizing Yahweh, which is pretty rare for non-Israelites to do. Baruch Yahweh, to invoke the tetragrammaton, the name of God, the true and living God. He says, "Blessed be Yahweh, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all gods." So this is a testimony to Jethro that Yahweh is the supreme deity who is greater than the other gods, which tells us that he has a belief in other gods existing. Everyone in the ancient world believed in many gods. That is the one thing that set Israel apart and made them unique, is that they seen one of the deities as being the creator and to be the supreme ruler over all the other deities. Now, some will extrapolate to the extreme and say the other deities did not exist at all, but that's not true based on the biblical evidence. They did. They were divine beings that were created by God, many of which rebelled against God, and they interacted with other civilizations in ancient history. There is archaeological and literary evidence of these encounters that are eerily similar from one area of the globe to the other. How is that possible without telecommunications that we have today? Because they had real encounters from real divine beings. Now, don't think like UFOs and flying saucers type stuff. We're talking about angelic beings. This is how we would best describe it or understand it. Angelic beings appearing to human beings, many of which misrepresented God, whom they should have represented, but they had defected, and they tried to gain worship for themselves instead of directing it towards Yahweh, the true and living God. And so he is admitting that Yahweh is the supreme deity, and he has exercised power over the other gods, in particular here, the gods of the Egyptians, which were many. And that was one of the purposes of the plagues, was to demonstrate the superiority of Yahweh over the gods that were worshipped in Egypt. And this needs to be said, the gods that were worshipped in Egypt did have power. Else, how were the magicians able to mimic some of the signs that Moses and Aaron were able to produce? They were able to a certain extent. But it came to a point where God showed his superiority, and then he also covered the Israelites from being affected by the plagues that the Egyptians were affected by, which rules out the natural phenomena theory involved in the plagues. This was divine judgment, and this was God putting a difference between the Egyptians and the Israelites, and where the plague would affect and where it would not. Okay, so these were miracles. These were major signs. Okay, I'm going to scroll up. Verse 11. We'll read it again. "Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them." I'm not even going to begin to try to explain that verse because it's a incomplete sentence in the Hebrew text, and it really doesn't make sense. And I've tried to go over it several times and make sense of what it really says, but it just really doesn't make sense, which leads me to believe that part of that sentence is missing. But whatever's being said here is bragging on Yahweh. We do know that much. So verse 12, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came, and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So we see here that Jethro is willing to offer burnt offering and sacrifices as well, which is another thing that is not uncommon amongst the other ancient civilizations that surrounded the Israelites, in that they offered sacrifices and burnt offerings to the gods they worship. The difference here is Jethro is doing this unto Yahweh because he has confessed Yahweh as being the supreme God over all the other gods, and so the appropriate response is to offer a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. Now, what is interesting here, though, is that Moses chose to use Elohim here instead of Yahweh. But if you look at a few verses earlier, he did invoke the divine name, so it should be understood and kind of go without saying. And this is another example of where the documentary hypothesis is kind of takes a blow, because within a few verses you have Yahweh used, and then a few verses later you have Elohim used, which kind of goes against their proposals for who wrote certain portions of the Torah. Okay? You have both within a few verses. So they also have a meal together. That's kind of a theme that runs through the Bible. Have y'all noticed that? Community, communal meals, sacrifices and offerings. Aren't you glad we can do communion instead of kill something and burn it and do that? Now, the burnt offering, an olah, is a type of offering that is totally consumed. The entire offering is consumed. It's burnt on the altar, all of it. The sacrifices here, zivchim, part of it would be burnt and part of it would be eaten. Okay? And so this would be part of the communal meal, which is why Jesus says, this is my body, right? You're partaking the sacrifice. You're eating the sacrifice, which probably explains why back in John, he went through the discourse, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part with me. That's why the Lord's Supper and communion is so vitally important to the New Covenant Church. It is a practice. It is an institution. It's something we should do on a regular basis. Okay? I didn't say right. And it came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from morning unto evening. Man, you just have to feel sorry for Moses, right? He leads them out in the wilderness, and they've complained pretty much every step of the way, unless things are, unless God's doing some miracle. And it's amazing. You know what's amazing? The same people who complained to him and accused him of bringing them in the wilderness to be killed, or all of the things that they said. Now they all want to be judged by Moses. Which is it? Right? Let's stone Moses. Let's accuse him of all these suppositions and accusations. But, the next day we want a war. Let's let him judge us all. We got to have Moses. And this would be an exhausting thing for one person to do. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, which tells us that the people are not only fussing and fighting against Moses and Aaron and Yahweh, but they're also fussing and fighting amongst what? Each other. Can you imagine? Well, don't you just want to go to heaven and just turn on the Netflix and watch some of the episodes of In the Wilderness? I think it would be awesome, right? They'd be like, oh my God, I don't feel so bad. We'd probably be saying, thank God we weren't there. So he's judging them all from daylight till dark. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did to the people, he said, "What is this thing that you do to the people? Why do you sit yourself alone, and all the people stand by you from morning unto evening?" So he says, hey, there's got to be a better way. How come you're the only one that can make judgment on these matters? It's exhausting for the people and especially for Moses. Because one thing about leadership, you take on the burdens of your people. There's just no way to escape it. It just comes with it. And so all of these situations that he would be having to judge over takes part of him. It would be exhausting and draining on him because he would be bearing the burden with the people, because he does care for the people. And he wants to represent God, and he wants to do what's right and just. And so he would give it a lot of consideration. So this would be extremely taxing on him. And Jethro sees this right away. And verse 15, and Moses said unto his father-in-law, because the people come unto me to inquire of God. Now we know that Moses is an in-between between God and the people. But does that mean he's the only one that can judge any matters that they face in the wilderness? Is there not other people in which authority can be delegated over maybe smaller matters? And we're going to see here that's the case. He says, verse 16, when they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of God and his laws. Now, this verse is one of the reasons why some say this story has to be out of chronological order. I don't think this verse here demands that be so, but it is a possibility. So he's judging between these issues. Verse 17, and Moses' father-in-law said unto him, this thing that you do is not good. And he explains why. You will surely wear away, both you and this people that is with you, for this thing is too heavy for you. And I would agree with him. I cannot even fathom what Moses was even attempting to do. I can't fathom what he has done up until this point, much less to sit every day and take on the burdens of a people that large, with that many problems, who are that carnal. Right? You know, it's hot in the wilderness. Undoubtedly, people are losing their temper. You can just imagine the drama. And this shows the character of Jethro. He's trying to look out for Moses and give him an advice. And we know up until this point, it's not for certain that Jethro would be a worshiper of Yahweh. Right? Not fully convinced that, Yahweh would be the only one in whom Jethro would worship. But he's still giving advice to Moses because he cares about him. And what he says, I think, is commendable, as we'll see here in just a moment. He says, you will surely wear away, both you and this people that is with you, for this thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to perform it yourself alone. Listen unto my voice, or hear my voice more appropriately in Hebrew. I think hearken is a little harsher tone than the way he says it in Hebrew. He says, hear my voice. I will give you counsel or advice, and God shall be with you. Which is, I think, his way of saying, I'm going to give you advice, but you run it by God and see what he thinks. Which should be our approach. We should be willing to listen to the counsel of others, especially if we find ourselves in a situation that Moses is in, where he would be extremely taxed, wore out, burdened, right? A lot of things we could say. But we still need to run the advice by God's word. especially in our situation, because we have the whole counsel of Scripture. Any advice that we get, we need to listen to, but we need to weigh it against Scripture. Kind of like Paul says in 2 Corinthians, we need to take everything and put it beside obedience to Christ. And if it cannot withstand what Christ has said or demanded of us, then we need to cast it aside and go with what Christ would want us to do. So he says, and God be with you, be thou for the people to Godward, that you may bring the causes unto God. And you shall teach them ordinances and laws, and shall show them the way wherein they must walk, and the work that they must do. Moreover, you shall provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, which is greed, and, because they could be tempted to be bribed as a judge, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. Now, that's probably not literal, just a way of saying delegate authority in ranks. Create a hierarchy and delegate authority to other people to judge these matters. Now, what's interesting about this is we know that Israel already has an established leadership in place. If you go back to when Moses and Aaron came to Israel, what did they do? What was the first thing they did? They performed signs before the elders of the people of Israel. So they already had elders that had some ruling authority prior to Moses and Aaron. So it seems like that has been done away with and replaced by Moses and Aaron's leadership. But now it's time to expand that because it's too much for Moses and Aaron. That's what they're doing. That's what Jethro is proposing here. So he says, verse 22, and let them judge the people at all seasons, or at all times more appropriately. And it shall be that every great matter they shall bring unto you. So this is going to be a huge relief for Moses, which is needed because he's going to need to spend time with God. And it's because of this reason that you could be inclined to place this in its proper place chronologically as happening before Mount Sinai, because this would be something that would be necessary, because Moses is going to be on Mount Sinai for a duration of time, and it would be helpful if there were appointed or delegated authority in place while he's on the mountain. Now we're going to see Aaron would be the ultimate authority in Moses' absence, and he kind of messes that all to pieces. We'll see that soon enough. But that's some evidence for this being in its chronological place. He says, so shall it be easier for yourself, and they shall bear the burden with you, if you shall do this thing. And so he puts this plan into practice for him and the Israelite people. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel. Now, I want to encourage you to go read Deuteronomy chapter 1, because in the retelling of this in Deuteronomy chapter 1, it's as if Moses allowed the people to give recommendations from presumably every tribe, at least, people that would be judges, and then ultimately Moses would decide amongst that. But he would have given the people somewhat of a voice in who they would recommend as able men. When you go to Deuteronomy, I think it gives different qualifications than that are stated here: men of wisdom and understanding and things of that nature. So this is a perfect example where the whole story is not being told, because you compare it to Deuteronomy 1, there are a lot of similarities, but there are extra things that are said in one or the other. So it's good to look at both places. So I encourage you to go to Deuteronomy 1 and look at that story. So it says, he chose able men out of all of Israel and made them heads over the people. rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens, and they judged the people at all seasons or times. The hard cases they brought unto Moses, but every small matter they judged themselves. And Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way into his own land. This verse right here is another fatal blow to Mount Sinai being in Midian, because Jethro leaves Mount Sinai and returns to his own land, which is Midian, which eliminates Mount Sinai. It's just another elimination process of doing away with Jebel el-Lawz as the location for Mount Sinai, because you can't depart from Midian and arrive in Midian. Just saying. So that's another slam dunk for things as we've discussed throughout the book of Exodus and trying to pinpoint the locations. So with that said, we are done at record time and we are open for questions. Amber?
It doesn't say 70, but for whatever reason I was thinking this was where they first established 70 elders. That, and I just
We'll see that story elsewhere.
So does that
because there will be 70 elders that will be appointed at some point in Israelite history, but not here.
It's not here. Okay.
Verse 11.
Verse 11.
Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them. Is he not just saying that all the gods that were in Egypt, the thing that they were supposed to be responsible for, that God showed them, even though they boasted that those gods were the best of that area, or the God of that area, that God was over every one of those. So saying that even though that was the gods of those areas, God's still above them. Something
to that effect. It's just...
Well, I took it he was just expounding more of why that he feels like God is the God now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has to do with the signs and the plagues that were performed, because those were direct judgments against the gods that were worshipped in Egypt. And so, as you said, to some effect, he's boasting in the Lord's superiority over those gods in the judgments of the plagues, in the signs. But it's just an odd sentence in Hebrew, and it just doesn't make sense. Something's missing.
So you said those gods obviously had power. So did God, as the creator, is that power he gave them for specific things, or is that what we would call now satanic power, or like when the Antichrist comes, he's going to have these powers and that will mimic God's powers?
In any of God's created beings, divine beings, which we would call angelic beings, they all have power. The Bible speaks of their superiority in power and strength in comparison to humanity. Now, because they're free will agents as humans, they have the opportunity to use their power for good or for evil, for God's purposes or to work against God's purposes. I believe that the powers that are used against God's purposes can all be called satanic powers, because the word Satan means adversary. So any power that would be working against God's design, God's word, God's created order would be an adverse or an adversary power, which would be a satanic force, a force of opposition. Kind of like you see Christ rebuke Peter, but he rebukes Satan. He says, Get behind me, Satan, adversary, enemy, opponent. Because he's addressing the force that was working through Peter. And so, yes, there are other forces that these would be considered malevolent forces or evil forces or satanic forces, however you want to say it.
So is that where we see what we think mythical gods like Zeus and Apollo and all of that? So
Yes. I believe wholeheartedly that many of the gods that were worshipped in these other cultures, like Apollos and Zeus and all of those, some of those which you mentioned, were real deities. They were real divine beings because we have iconography of what they look like. And it's amazing how similar they are across the globe, where they would have had no communication ever. And you have these deities that are visiting people in different locations, and they draw them exactly the same. And many of them that you see in the hieroglyphics and the iconographies are similar to what is described of the cherubim in the throne room scene in Revelation, and what you would see described in Ezekiel and other places in the Old Testament. So many of them defected. Amber?
I don't really have a question, but it was more when you were talking about this whole sequence of events where the lesser Elohim rebelled against God and misrepresented the authority. It just made me realize that just reaffirms that there is no new thing, because humans do exactly that thing. You think about any kind of a leadership structure, or any type of organization or government, you delegate authority out, and that authority can either properly represent the top or take the glory for themselves and kind of undermine and infiltrate, usurp, try to gain the glory for themselves. And you see it happening everywhere all the time, and it's nothing new. It started back then. Free will agents, right?
Yep. Rob?
Whereabouts in his journey did he break down his leadership roles? Was it towards the end of the journey, or midway, or you know what I'm saying?
As far as the 70 elders, or as far as what we just read?
The hundreds of the tens and all that broke down. Because when his father told him he couldn't
he would have put it in place immediately. So you're looking at right at 3 months into the wilderness journey.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know if it was right before they went into Israel or what.
No, it's right here.
Okay.
Yeah, it's rehearsed before they go into the land in Deuteronomy. That takes place, in the final months of Moses' life, where he's rehearsing what's called the book of Deuteronomy. But he would have put this plan in place right here about 3 months into their departure from Egypt. Any other questions?
That prior to the 40 years of going in circles?
Yes, this is at the beginning of the 40 years of wandering.
It mentions Zipporah and her two sons. Was Moses' dad, or was that his second wife?
This is his wife that he gained whenever he fled into the wilderness after he had killed the man in Egypt, and had two sons. We'll see that there is another woman mentioned when we get into the book of Numbers who is called a Cushite, and we'll discuss that when we get there. But this would be Jethro's daughter.
Did he not want her and the boys to go with him in there, or was that her decision?
It doesn't really spell out the details of that. We just know that they did not enter Egypt, that they went back and was with Jethro during the plagues and the Exodus. But, you're talking about several months that they had been apart, but here they're reunited when they reach the location where God had told Moses prior to return to, and they would have been aware of that. Any other questions?
Would it be odd for his wife and two children to travel by themselves that far through the wilderness, no matter which way you take, to get back to Midian?
I would assume that they would have been sent with others. It's not, like I said, there's not very many details of how that happened in chapter 4, which again leads me to believe part of that chapter is missing as far as the details. Any other questions? All right.